Hey everybody, last lesson that we're going to take a look here at the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, and so we're into the 1960s, and we left off yesterday with President Johnson having the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 being passed to really give African Americans and other ethnic minorities a victory in their search for political rights. But what we need to understand is that even though those laws declared that all races were equal, racism still exists in America, right? And we know this because there's these laws don't change attitudes or values. This prejudice or discrimination against a person because of race is still going to be there. So that even with their political victories, African Americans are going to end up still suffering worse than other white families. So for examples of this might be the fact that by the mid-1960s, a black family's income for the same work is only 55% of what a white family would have for the same job. So what we see here then is by the 1950s and 60s, poverty is trapping many African Americans in inner cities, and they're not able to get out of that inner city even if they'd wanted to. Another example might even be things like the unemployment rate by race. So like if you look here, for example, the red line that you have at the bottom is white unemployment, which is low, but then higher than white unemployment is Hispanic and black unemployment. I mean, there's a clear discrepancy. So all the way from the 70s through almost the present day, there's this difference in even the amount of people that are employed based upon race. So what you have then by the mid-1960s are frustrations in the black community over this lingering racism, this economic unfairness, and you're going to see that erupt in riots. And the first place those riots are going to erupt are going to be in places like the one right above my head, which is Watts, Los Angeles, where police brutality allegations sparked the riots, but really the anger is about economic conditions. It might be police brutality that spark riots, but it's anger about economic conditions that really cause those riots to get out of control and spread. And what we're going to see is that in these conditions, thousands and thousands of members of the National Guard and police are needed to restore order. And then once this kind of expression of anger over these lingering economic conditions begin, it can't be stopped. Over the next 4 years, between 1964 to 1968, we're going to see riots in dozens more cities, millions of dollars worth of damage. Detroit, Michigan alone, $200 million in damage. We had riots right here in New York City where people were being killed. The National Guard was called out in 1968, 69. It was an absolute mess over this anger regarding economic concerns. And so the government's going to try and figure out what's causing this. You know, and our government, in its wisdom, determines that the best way to figure out what's going on with this is to set up a commission. So they create this Kerner Commission. It's led by a guy named Kerner. And it studies the causes of these urban riots, and it's going to make some recommendations. And so this commission comes out in 1968, and it says, and it is a very detailed study, and it says that the causes of urban riots it's actually white society and white racism that leads to the majority of problems in inner cities. And to try and solve that problem, the commission says we need to create better paying inner city jobs, we need better public housing for people, but the problem is we don't have the money to spend on that because we were spending our money on flexible response. We're fighting the Vietnam War by 1968. So we're not going to see these recommendations change. We're not going to see new, better paying jobs in the inner cities. We're not going to see new, better housing options available for people. And so what we end up with then is a government studying the problems of these issues, and they determine the problem happens to be racism. That's shocking. And then they're not able to do anything about it. And it's precisely because they can't do anything about it that we're going to see some real big changes. After the passage of that Voting Rights Act in 1965, for example, Martin Luther King is going to shift his focus from political issues to economic issues. He, for example, moves to the slums of Southside Chicago to draw attention to the poverty in Southside Chicago, but he has very little impact. He has very little success at making change. In fact, the white mobs in Chicago are more violent towards King and African Americans protesting than they were actually in Birmingham, Alabama. Why? Because now, all of a sudden, the nice white people in the nice North were being told that they had a privilege and benefits that black people didn't, and they didn't like that. So they were fighting back against it to keep the power and privilege that they had. And what happens here is because of the lack of change, many black Americans wonder if nonviolent protests can actually change economic problems. Some of them feel like it can't. So more and more black Americans are going to turn to black power as a solution. And what they do is they say, well, you know what? Why don't we, with black power, kind of mobilize the political and economic power of African Americans so that they have, they demand respect for their rights. They demand to improve conditions because they deserve that. You know, because black power is incredibly different than nonviolent resistance because of a couple things. Number one, self-defense is acceptable. If somebody hits you, you can hit them back in black power. Instead of provoking white violence with nonviolent passive-aggressive resistance, so that politicians, white politicians, make change, black Americans want to put pressure on whites by using their own economic and political strength. So in other words, you would have people working to change the way the system worked. You know, why do we have white-owned hospitals in our neighborhoods? Let's get black-owned hospitals. Why do we have a mostly white police force? Let's get a black police force. Why do we have schools taught by mostly white people? Let's get black people teaching those schools. By doing this, you become less reliant on white America, and that puts pressure on them. So instead of working to create like this one happy-go-lucky America full of mixtures of races, black pride and cultural differences are celebrated, so that they would say, you know, basically, well, we don't need white America. The group most associated with this Black Power movement is the Black Panther Party. You can see a picture of them just there above my head, the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party was organized in 1966. It calls for black control of institutions in black neighborhoods, and Martin Luther King responds to all of this and says it's a philosophy of hopelessness. You only turn to violence when you're hopeless. And he encourages black Americans to use their power not to hurt others. Why would you want to hurt other people? That's his call to action. He understands the frustration, the hopelessness, but he says you have to instead turn to love, not violence, to solve that problem. There are definitely leaders who disagree with King about that, like the guy right above my head, Malcolm X. He becomes the first popular spokesperson of the Black Power movement. He was born Malcolm Little, but he goes to prison in 1946 for burglary, and while he's in prison, he educates himself, and he joins a black nationalist movement that he calls the Nation of Islam. They're also called black Muslims. And black nationalists, whether it's the Nation of Islam or some other group, they believe that whites and blacks should be separate. There should be segregation because whites are incapable of treating blacks as equals. So if white people are always going to treat black people as less, then we shouldn't keep trying to integrate with them. We should say, forget the white people, and we should take care of ourselves. Now, despite their name, black Muslims do not have the same beliefs as regular Muslims, but they preach black nationalism. They include this belief of separation, and in many cases, they would argue for violence. So Malcolm Little changed his name to Malcolm X. He wants to break with his slave owner's past. Many people don't know this, but if you're a black American and you can trace your ancestry back to slavery, your last name actually is the last name of a slave owner in many, many cases. So Malcolm Little didn't want that. He wanted to break away from that, so he calls himself Malcolm X, and he says that any means necessary should be used to obtain black liberation. It takes some time, but Malcolm X changes his philosophy. He breaks with this kind of black nationalist, black Muslim, any means necessary perspective in 1964 when he goes to a pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca, where he sees Muslims from all races come together. So here in this gigantic area around in the holy city of Mecca, you have Muslims from all over the world, white, black, Asian, all over the world together. And he realizes that an integrated society is possible. If you can have an integrated religion, then you can have an integrated society. And because he breaks with black Muslims, members of the Nation of Islam, they kill him, they assassinate him because he betrayed their ideas. And things don't end well for King either. When he is supporting a strike by African American sanitation workers in Tennessee, Memphis, Tennessee, he's assassinated on April 4th. In 1968. So you have both leaders of the movement, whether it was the black nationalists, any means necessary, Malcolm X, being assassinated by the people that he once supported, or whether it is King being assassinated in 1968 as leader of the nonviolent movement. What we end up seeing is a nation in mourning. Mourning's riots in more than 100 cities over this anger, this frustration over the assassination. But we do see Congress react to King's death in 1968. They passed the 1968 Civil Rights Act, which does contain a fair housing provision, which says that you can't discriminate against people based on race when you are selling homes or renting homes. But the long-term issue here is that after King's death, the movement lacks a leader. It lacks vision. And it slowly falls apart, which is why we have the complicated picture today of race and economy and politics and housing that we looked at just yesterday in class. And so we'll do more with this here in class together.